Vygotsky, Thought and Language, Chapter 3, Stern's Theory of Language Development. The part of William Stern's system that is best known and has actually gained ground over the years is his intellectualistic conception of speech development in the child. Yet it is precisely this conception that plainly reveals the limitations and inconsistencies of Stern's philosophical and psychological personalism, its idealistic foundations, and scientific invalidity. Stern himself describes his point of view as personalistic, genetic. We shall discuss the personalistic principle later on. Let us see first how Stern deals with the genetic aspect, and let us state from the outset that his theory, like all intellectualistic theories, is by its very nature anti-developmental. Stern distinguishes three roots of speech: the expressive tendency, the social, and the intentional. While the first two underlie also the rudiments of speech observed in animals, the third is specifically human. Stern defines intentionality in this sense as a directedness toward a certain content or meaning. At a certain stage of his psychic development, he says, man acquires the ability to mean something when uttering sounds, to refer to something objective. In substance, such intentional acts are already acts of thought. Their appearance denotes intellectualization and objectification of speech. In agreement with a number of writers who represent the new psychology of thought, though to a lesser degree than some of them, Stern stresses the importance of the logical factor in the development of language. We have no quarrel with his statement that advanced human speech possesses objective meaning and therefore presupposes a certain level in the development of thinking, and we agree that it is necessary to take account of the close relationship that exists between language and logical thinking. The trouble is that Stern regards intentionality, a trait of advanced speech which properly calls for a genetic explanation, i.e. how it came into being in the evolutionary process, as one of the roots of speech development, a driving force, an innate tendency, almost an urge, at any rate something primordial, on a par genetically with the expressive and the communicative tendencies, which indeed are found at the very beginnings of speech. In viewing intentionality in this way, die intentionale Treibfeder des Sprachdranges, he substitutes an intellectualist explanation for the genetic one. This method of explaining a thing by the very thing that needs explaining is the basic flaw of all intellectualistic theories and of Stern's in particular. Hence its general hollowness and its anti-genetic quality. Traits belonging to advanced speech are relegated to its beginnings. Stern answers the question of why and how speech acquires meaning by saying, from the intentional tendency, i.e. the tendency toward meaning. We are reminded of Moliere's physician who explained the soporific effect of opium by its soporific properties. From Stern's famous description of the great discovery made by the child of 1½ or 2, we can see to what exaggerations overemphasis on the logical aspects can lead. At that age, the child first realizes that each object has its permanent symbol, a sound pattern that identifies it, i.e., that each thing has a name. Stern believes that a child in the second year of his life can become aware of symbols and of the need for them, and he considers this discovery already a thought process in the proper sense. Quote, "The understanding of the relation between sign and meaning that dawns on the child at this point is something different in principle from the simple use of sound images, object images, and their associations. And the requirement that each object of whatever kind have its name may be considered a true generalization made by the child, possibly his first." End quote. Are there any factual and theoretical grounds for assuming that a child of 1½ or 2 has an awareness of the symbolic function of language and a consciousness of a general rule, a general concept? All the studies made of this problem in the last 20 years suggest a negative answer to this question. Everything we know of the mentality of the child of 1½ or 2 clashes with the idea that he might be capable of such complex intellectual operations. Both observation and experimental studies indicate that he grasps only much later the relationship between sign and meaning, or the functional use of signs. This is quite beyond a child of 2. Furthermore, systematic experimental investigations have shown that the grasping of the relation between sign and meaning, and the transition to operating with signs, never result from an instantaneous discovery or invention by the child. Stern believes that the child discovers the meaning of language once and for all. Actually, this is an extremely complex process which has its natural history, i.e. its early beginnings and transitional forms on the more primitive developmental levels, and also its cultural history, again with its own series of phases, its own quantitative, qualitative, and functional growth, its own dynamics and laws. Stern virtually ignores the intricate ways leading to the ripening of the sign function. His conception of linguistic development is immensely simplified. The child suddenly discovers that speech has meaning. Such an explanation of how speech becomes meaningful truly deserves to be grouped with the theory of the deliberate invention of language, the rationalistic theory of the social contract, and other famous intellectualistic theories. All of them disregard the genetic realities and do not really explain anything. Factually, too, Stern's theory fails to stand up. Wallin, Kafka, Piaget, Delacroix, and many others in their studies of normal children, and K. Buehler in his study of deaf-mute children, have found one, that the discovery by the child of the tie between word and object does not immediately lead to a clear awareness of the symbolic relationship of sign and referent, characteristic of well-developed thought, that the word for a long time appears to the child as an attribute or a property of the object, rather than as a mere sign, that the child grasps the external structure object word before he can grasp the internal relation sign referent, and 2, that the discovery made by the child is not in reality a sudden one, the exact instant of which can be defined. A series of long and complicated molecular changes leads up to that critical moment in speech development. That Stern's basic observation was correct, that there is indeed a moment of discovery which to gross observation appears unprepared, has been established beyond doubt during the 20 years since his study was first published. The decisive turning point in the child's linguistic, cultural, and intellectual development discovered by Stern does exist, though he was wrong to interpret it intellectualistically. Stern points out 2 objective symptoms of the occurrence of the critical change: the appearance of inquiries about names of objects, and the resulting sharp, saccadic increases in the child's vocabulary, both of major importance for the development of speech. The active search for words on the part of the child, which has no analogy in the development of speech in animals, indicates a new phase in his linguistic progress. It is at this time that the grandiose signal system of speech, to quote Pavlov, emerges for the child from the mass of all other signals and assumes a specific function and behavior. To have established this fact on a firm basis of objective symptoms is one of Stern's great achievements. The gap in his explanation of it is all the more striking. In contrast with the 2 other roots of language, the expressive and the communicative, whose development has been traced from the lowest social animals to anthropoids and to man, the intentional tendency appears out of nowhere. It has no history and no derivation. According to Stern, it is basic, primordial. It springs up spontaneously once and for all. This is the propensity enabling the child to discover the function of speech by way of a purely logical operation. To be sure, Stern does not say all this in so many words. He engaged in polemics not only with the proponents of anti-intellectualistic theories, who trace the beginnings of speech in children to affective, conative processes exclusively, but also with those psychologists who overrate the child's capacity for logical thinking. Stern does not repeat that mistake, but he makes a graver one in assigning to intellect an almost metaphysical position of primacy as the origin, the unanalyzable first cause of meaningful speech. Paradoxically, intellectualism of this kind proves especially inadequate in the study of intellectual processes, which at first glance would seem to be its legitimate sphere of application. One might expect, for instance, that much light would be thrown on the relation between speech and thought when the meaningfulness of language is regarded as a result of an intellectual operation. Actually, such an approach, stipulating as it does an already formed intellect, blocks an investigation of the involved dialectical interactions of thought and speech. Stern's treatment of this cardinal aspect of the problem of language is full of inconsistencies and is the weakest part of his book. Such important topics as inner speech, its emergence, and its connection with thought are barely touched upon by Stern. He reviews the results of Piaget's investigation of egocentric speech merely in his discussion of children's conversations, ignoring the functions, the structure, and the developmental significance of that form of speech. Altogether, Stern fails to relate the complex functional and structural changes in thinking to the development of speech. Even when Stern gives a correct characterization of a developmental phenomenon, his theoretical framework prevents him from drawing the obvious conclusions from his own observations. Nowhere is this fact more apparent than in his failure to see the implications of his own translation of the child's very first words into the language of adults. The interpretation given to the first words of the child is the touchstone of every theory of child speech. It is the focal point at which all the major trends in modern speech theories meet and cross. One might say without exaggeration that the whole structure of a theory is determined by the translation of the first words of the child. Stern believes that they should be interpreted neither from the purely intellectualistic nor from the purely affective, conative point of view. He acknowledges Mumin's great merit in opposing the intellectualistic theory that the child's first words actually designate objects as such. He does not, however, share Mumin's assumption that the first words are merely expressions of the emotions and wishes of the child. Through his analysis of situations in which they appear, he proves quite conclusively that these words contain also a certain direction toward an object, and that this objective reference or pointing function often predominates over the moderately emotional tone. This is how Stern translates first words. Quote, "The childish mama, translated into advanced speech, does not mean the word mother, but rather a sentence such as Mama, come here, or Mama, give me, or Mama, put me in the chair, or Mama, help me." End quote. When we observe the child in action, however, it becomes obvious that it's not only the word Mama which means, say, Mama, put me in the chair, but the child's whole behavior at that moment, his reaching out toward the chair, trying to hold on to it, etc. Here the affective, conative directedness toward an object, to use Mumin's terms, is as yet inseparable from the intentional tendency of speech. The two are still a homogeneous whole, and the only correct translation of Mama, or of any other early words, is the pointing gesture. The word at first is a conventional substitute for the gesture. It appears long before the child's crucial discovery of language, and before he is capable of logical operations. Stern himself admits the mediatory role of gestures, especially pointing, in establishing the meaning of first words. The inescapable conclusion would be that pointing is, in fact, a precursor of the intentional tendency. Yet Stern declines to trace the genetic history of that tendency. To him, it does not evolve from the effective object-directedness of the pointing act, gesture, or first words. It appears out of nowhere, and it accounts for the emergence of meaning. The same anti-genetic approach also characterizes Stern's treatment of all the other major issues discussed in his pithy book, such as the development of concepts and the main stages in the development of speech and thought. Nor can it be otherwise. This approach is a direct consequence of the philosophical premises of personalism, the system developed by Stern. Stern tries to rise above the extremes of both empiricism and nativism. He opposes his own view of the development of speech on the one hand, to Wundt's, who sees child speech as a product of environment, while the child's own participation is essentially passive, and, on the other hand, to the view of those psychologists to whom primary speech, onomatopoeia, and so-called nursery talk is the invention of countless generations of children. Stern takes care not to disregard the part that imitation plays in speech development, or the role of the child's spontaneous activity, by applying to these issues his concept of convergence. The child's conquest of speech occurs through a constant interaction of inner dispositions prompting the child to speech and external conditions, i.e. the speech of people around him, which provide both stimulation and material for the realization of these dispositions. Convergence, to Stern, is a general principle to be applied to the explanation of all human behavior. Truly this is one more instance when we may say with Goethe, "The words of science hide its substance." The sonorous word convergence, denoting here a perfectly unassailable methodological principle, i.e., that development should be studied as a process determined by the interaction of organism and environment, in fact, releases the author from the task of analyzing the social, environmental factors in speech development. Stern does say quite emphatically, it is true, that social environment is the main factor in speech development, but in reality he limits its role to merely accelerating or slowing down the development, which obeys its own immanent laws. As we have tried to show by using the example of his explanation of how meaning emerges in speech, Stern greatly overrated the role of the internal organismic factors. This bias is a direct outcome of the personalistic frame of reference. The person, to Stern, is a psychophysically neutral entity that, in spite of the multiplicity of its part functions, manifests a unitary, goal-directed activity. This idealistic, monadic conception of the individual person naturally leads to a theory which sees language as rooted in personal teleology. Hence, the intellectualism and the anti-genetic bias of Stern's approach to problems of linguistic development. Applied to the eminently social mechanism of speech behavior, Stern's personalism, ignoring as it does the social side of personality, leads to patent absurdities. His metaphysical conception of personality, deriving all developmental processes from personal teleology, turns the real genetic relations between personality and language upside down. Instead of a developmental history of the personality itself, in which language plays a far from minor role, we have the metaphysical theory that personality generates language out of the goal-directedness of its own essential nature.